How were all of the artillery roles combined to support the defeat of Panzer Army Africa and Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein? We look at the orchestration and synchronization of artillery effects in support of the preparation and conduct of Operation Lightfoot.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 89 of the Principles of War podcast. This is part of our ongoing look at the Second Battle of El Alamein and the second in our mini-series looking at the conduct of the artillery battle. Last week we had a really pertinent quote from Shelford Bidwell's book, The Gunners, and I just want to reiterate this because it is really quite important and it's a good segue into what we're going to be talking about today. He wrote, "What is deplorable in an exercise and a crime in war was the general failure to provide effective artillery support in the shape of planned and organised fire. The guiding principle for any artilleryman, whether he is supporting a company or a corps, is that the infantry must never be allowed to go into the attack without carefully planned covering fire from every available gun based on the best available information about the enemy." Now, he would go on to write that infantry allowed to attack naked of support other than the observation of targets of opportunity, which in artillery terms is locking the stable door after the horse has bolted. Not good enough to argue the pace of modern operations precluded fire planning. The greater the mobility, the greater the need for artillery fire to be both anticipatory and prophylactic. If artillery techniques are too slow, then they would have to be made faster. Now, this is really important for two reasons. We're going to be looking at some of the techniques that were developed in the field by the gunners to ensure that the response to calls for fire in support of the infantry were as quick as they could be, were as responsive as they needed to be to ensure that the infantry got the fires that they needed. Bidwell also wrote about the importance of exercises to highlight deficiencies. And so last week we looked at Exercise Bumper, conducted in 1941, the largest exercise ever conducted by the British Army. It was an anti-invasion exercise with 2 corps on each side. And it highlighted significant deficiencies from a command and control point of view. I wonder how often exercises are conducted, deficiencies are glossed over because it's an exercise and no one actually died. The impetus of Exercise Bumper was that the Germans were at Calais looking across the coast, looking at England, and there was significant fear that England was going to be invaded. That meant that everything that went wrong was looked at in the harsh reality of daylight so that all of the lessons could be extracted and critically, changes could be made. Exercise Bumper, very interesting. The chief umpire, so it's a big war game. For all war games, you have an umpire. The umpire for this was Lieutenant General Bernard Law Montgomery, who is now, as far as our story goes, is the commander of 8th Army, and his chief artillery advisor on the umpiring team is Brigadier Kirkman. He would be the artillery advisor for Montgomery at Second El Alamein. It was Kirkman who went through all of the lessons learned, all of the C2 horror that occurred during Exercise Bumper, and started putting through the changes that were required to ensure that the artillery could be properly controlled and coordinated. And by that, I mean centralised. This podcast series is about 150 years of Australian permanent artillery. I'm going to talk about something that has got nothing to do with Australian artillery because it is really important for the development of artillery, a huge development that occurred in the Second World War, which the Australian artillery completely missed out on. This is the apogee of Australian artillery in the Second World War. Brigadier Ramsay is going to command the largest number of guns that any Australian gunner commanded in the Second World War. And from here, the Australian forces are going to move into the Southwest Pacific area of operations. Concentrations of artillery are going to be a lot smaller. But the trajectory that we've seen in the battles leading up to First El Alamein, where more control is being pulled in and guns are being centralised to be able to ensure that we get that concentration of force, that trend is going to continue. The development that I'm talking about is the AGRA, the Army Group Royal Artillery. This is a concentration of artillery forces above the divisional level. And it came out of the findings from Exercise Bumper. Kirkman was doing what he could to centralise artillery as much as he could, whilst ensuring that it was as responsive as it needed to be. Bumper was held in September 1941, and it wasn't until the 26th of November 1942 that the concept of the AGRA was officially sanctioned and given the command appointments and staff that it would need in order to control all of its artillery. They were first used by First Army in the Mediterranean campaign and would be further developed after the D-Day invasion and through the Far East. The composition of the AGRAs varied throughout the armies, but generally it was 3 medium regiments, 1 heavy regiment and 1 field regiment. The weighting in medium and heavy guns made it an excellent tool for the counter-battery fight. But it was also a tool that an army commander or a corps commander could use to weight his main effort. A corps would usually have its own AGRA in support, and when heavy fire support was needed, then one AGRA's fires could be superimposed on another's. This was done during the initial attack on the Italian mainland when 2 AGRAs fired across the Strait of Messina from Sicily in support of landings. Towards the end of the war, manpower shortages decreased the combat power that a division was able to generate, and so the firepower of the AGRA was often used to supplement firepower. One of the unsung heroes of the artillery battles are the electrical and mechanical engineers. These soldiers in workshops work to ensure that the guns are able to continue firing. They provide the maintenance and conduct repairs. When the AGRA concept was initially created, it didn't have its own Ramey support, and that proved to be an issue because it needed to draw on corps level Ramey, and there just wasn't enough Ramey elements to go around. So switching large groups of guns from one corps to another would create a huge strain. So towards the end of the war, the AGRAs gained their own Ramey support, which enabled them to support themselves much better, particularly in environments where there was constrained logistic support. So just think about the flexibility that an AGRA gives a corps commander or an army commander. If he's got a division that's going into an assault and he thinks they might be a little bit underdone, or he thinks the objective is going to be quite hard nut to crack, he can use an AGRA. He can superimpose another AGRA on top of that. If they do that, if there's 2 AGRAs supporting a divisional assault, that's an extra 10 regiments of fires. 6 of them being mediums and 2 of them being heavies. There will be enough guns there to ensure that the counter-battery battle is won. And on top of that, the supported arm, as they're moving in for the assault, they will have more than enough guns to be able to do this. It gives a lot of flexibility to commanders. Important to remember, Second El Alamein, there is no AGRA. This concept isn't in force at the time. But what Montgomery is doing through Kirkman is ensuring that he is able to weight his assaults, and this is going to be the 9th Div assault. They are going to be conducting some very tough battles, and so he weights his main effort, which becomes 9th Division, and he weights them in battles which are really quite perilous with a significant amount of artillery. So he's coming up with an ad hoc AGRA capability. The Army Group Royal Artillery really is at the high end of the operational level when we look at the ability to synchronise effects. We're going to go all the way to the other end now and look at how they synchronised effects at the tactical level. One of the issues that the 8th Army had was, how do you synchronise watches across an entire theatre? This is something that's very difficult to do, but it's something that's very important to do for a couple of reasons. It's difficult to do because there is constraints on the use of radio, because you don't want enemy direction finders to be locating where radios are transmitting from. And also, there's probably not going to be enough telephone cable between all of the units that need to be synchronized. It's important because of what we call time on target. Most of the casualties in an artillery barrage occur in the first 60 seconds of that barrage. That is because it is when you are most likely to catch troops out in the open. In the first 60 seconds, they'll be looking for somewhere where they can go and get effective cover. This is why when artillery planning is done, you're looking at the time of the effect occurring on the terrain rather than when the guns are going to fire. It can be quite a big difference. If you've got medium or heavy guns firing at 20 kilometres, the time that they fire will be very different based on the different time of flight than a gun like the 25-pounder firing much closer in. Synchronizing all of those rounds is going to maximize the surprise, maximize the effect that the barrage is going to have. Not only that, it's not just the gunners that you want to synchronize with, it's also with the supported arm. If you've got infantry who are going into an assault, they'll want to know exactly when the guns are going to start firing, and they're going to want to know exactly when they're going to stop firing as well. That's really important to get that coordination. It's usually done with gunner time. How do we synchronize that time across all of the guns and with all of the other units in the theatre? Pemberton writes in his Lessons Learnt book, "The superiority of the sudden and concentrated burst of fire over the desultory bombardment has long been recognised, and if the number of guns involved was large and the times of flight of the shell was very different, it was found desirable to have the time laid down in orders that should indicate the moment not at which the guns were to open fire, but at which the shells were to arrive at the target. This originated the time on target procedure, which subsequently became very popular." Now, the problem was to synchronise timings under moving warfare conditions in the desert. The solution was to listen to the BBC time signal and regulate the fire in accordance with them. This is a great solution to a fairly difficult problem. It's a problem that we don't have today because everyone's got access to GPS, and the GPS has a time signal built into it, a very accurate time signal. That's where the accuracy of the position comes from. However, we could be conducting operations in a GPS-denied environment, and if that was the case, then the ability to synchronise watches would be much more difficult, and something like this could be very useful. Next, we're going to look at the role of the anti-tank gunners, and the best information that I can find is from Pemberton, which is interesting because this was written in 1950 from the artillery lessons learned from the Second World War. However, many of the arguments that he looks at kind of sound fairly familiar today if we look at contemporary operations like Nagorno-Karabakh and Ukraine. We see the back and forth struggle between protected mobility, armour, and the offensive firepower that seeks to defeat it. At Alamein, there were numerous occasions where traditional artillery, so we're talking about predominantly 25-pounders, but sometimes medium and the heavies, were required to treat tank attacks. Usually this would be a regimental fire mission, but there was one occasion where there were 2 divisional artilleries and 3 medium regiments that were firing on one grid square that contained 60 tanks of the 21st Panzer Division. These tanks had come to a temporary halt, but despite all of the firepower that was brought to bear against them, the result was to be as expected. Traditional artillery is not that great against armour. The effect that was generated was much more moral than physical. However, it would force them to close down, and it would prevent them from refueling or replenishing ammunition. If they were on the move, it would often force them to change direction. One weapon that we have within our arsenal that they didn't have at Alamein, of course, is smart and brilliant rounds, and these are much more effective against tanks. From this point, there was no getting away from the fact that the final antidote for the tank attack must be the anti-tank gun. For a year or more, the 25-pounder had filled the breach in the anti-tank defences and had once more staved off disaster, but except at short range, it was not really a good killer of tanks. The provision of the anti-tank shot had in fact been intended only for self-defence, and it was perhaps a tribute to the designers and to the skill of improvisation acquired by British gunners during the lean years between 39 and 42 that confusion had arisen regarding the relative importance of the field and anti-tank roles, and that the BRA 8th Army now found it necessary to issue a warning that, as an anti-tank weapon, the 25-pounder was far inferior to the 6-pounder. You'll remember from previous episodes that the 6-pounder only really became available in good numbers at 2nd El Alamein. This was because of a design decision that was made in 1939. The 2-pounder, which was thought to be getting a little bit long in the tooth, lacking in the ability to penetrate armour, was available for production there and then. And so the decision was made to continue on with that production rather than halting production and working on the improvement to the 2-pounder, which would be the 6-pounder. This is why it took so long for the 6-pounder to come into service, and it's why we need to be thinking so far in advance when it comes to weapons procurement, because that weapons procurement process is often a lot more difficult once combat starts, because there is a prodigious requirement to produce weapons. And this is why, up until now, the anti-tank regiments had only had the 2-pounders. The 2-pounders had been replaced by the 6-pounders, which much more penetrating power, and the 2-pounders had gone to the infantry. Now, they weren't retired, they were given to the infantry, and this is because of the heavy armoured threat that was occurring in the Middle East theatre. Any area where there is a heavy armoured threat means that you'll be looking for all opportunities to bulk up your anti-armoured capabilities. It wasn't just the British that were guilty of this. The Germans as well, particularly in the guns that were on their tanks. And when we look at the Battle of Ston in the Battle of France, you'll be able to feel the exasperation of the German tankers as they are repeatedly firing at the Char B2 bis and the rounds just bouncing off. They discover during the battle that there's a grill that covers the air intake, and that is the weak point on the Char B2 bis. So not only do they have to get close enough to be able to engage the tank, they have to be able to get close enough to be able to engage a specific spot on the tank. That made it very difficult for them. The Char B2 bis being a particularly well-armoured vehicle. Pemberton writes that the tactical effect of increasing the thickness of the frontal tank armour was to induce the anti-tank gunner to engage his target from a flank rather than head-on. Thus, the basic principles of anti-tank defence had been increased from 2 to 3: defilade, enfilade, and depth. During the previous period, there'd been a tendency to use anti-tank guns for protecting the flanks of the field guns. This was now discouraged, and a return was made to the old principle where the field and anti-tank gun layouts should be complementary, the former adding depth to the anti-tank dispositions as a whole. For the local protection of the field artillery troop, use was made of medium machine guns, sighted one on each flank of the troop. These guns would help to keep enemy tanks closed down and would engage enemy infantry that might be riding on them or following up in the attack in lorries. What about defeating the Axis anti-tank screens? Pemberton writes, during the infantry attacks, the enemy anti-tank guns had presented no great difficulty. Some had been hit by the barrages and concentrations, and it all had been quickly overrun by the infantry. In fact, General von Thoma, commanding the Afrika Corps, subsequently attributed his defeat more than anything else to the destruction of over 50% of his anti-tank guns by our artillery fire. In the armoured battle, however, the problem of the anti-tank screen had yet to be completely solved. The enemy, as usual, was quick to build up new screens and stem a breakthrough, and these sometimes inflicted heavy casualties upon our armour before they had been finally mastered. Although training instructions issued on the 17th of August had insisted that priority must be given to the neutralisation of anti-tank weapons and had emphasised the value of smoke for this purpose, there was still a tendency for some formations to neglect its use and to advance to the attack without making a prearranged fire plan. In some circumstances, the time lag between a tank squadron being held up and the forward observation officer being able to bring down effective fire might vary from 5 minutes to 5 hours, depending on whether the guns were in action or not, the number of the enemy anti-tank guns, the nature of the ground, and the degree of visibility. Yet in at least one armoured brigade, the 23rd, the soundness of the official doctrine had been amply demonstrated, and as a result, the proportion of smoke shell carried by its artillery regiment had been increased to 33 1/3%. The conclusions to be drawn out appeared to be as follows. Against carefully prepared and dug positions in depth, it would always be necessary to mount a full-scale infantry attack heavily supported by artillery. Small anti-tank localities with a preponderance of small-caliber anti-tank weapons might be dealt with direct by armoured units supported by concentrations from at least one artillery regiment. Lastly, the hastily constituted anti-tank screen not dug in could first be neutralised by medium machine gun fire and then knocked out gun by gun by the Sherman tanks and by the self-propelled units of the supporting artillery. For the present, however, it had to be accepted that the anti-tank gun was still the most serious menace to the tank, and that the enemy still had the advantage of superior equipment, including ammunition and sights. He's talking there, of course, of the German 88, which had excellent German sights. The optics, along with its very high muzzle velocity, enabled it to engage targets out at very long range. The other component of what Pemberton's written there, the importance of smoke. If you've got an enemy who's going to be firing in a direct fire role, as the German 88s would have been doing, and they would have had supporting elements there for the defence of their location, if they are unable to see the enemy as they attack, so this is the Allied tanks as they're trundling towards the anti-tank position, if they're unable to see them, then they're not able to engage them. They are effectively neutralised, and at the last moment, those tanks are going to pop out of the smoke, and there won't be enough time for the gunners to be able to engage the tanks. Ideally, they'll be supporting infantry, although at Alamein that wouldn't be occurring, but ideally you'd have infantry. They would get out of their armoured personnel carriers, and they would then be able to capture the guns. So obscuration, blinding, important artillery tasks, and you can see the importance of it in the fact that 1 in 3 shells was smoke for the self-propelled artillery regiments that were supporting the tanks. As a side note, in World War I, a similar role was played by gas, where it was able to neutralise enemy infantry for an extended period of time. Next, we'll look at illumination on the battlefield. Today, contemporary artillery can fire a flare which will descend under a parachute and illuminate the terrain underneath it. This can be used to support an attack. It can also be used to investigate suspicious movement or activity. It can be used to signal. The illumination can even be infrared, so only people with infrared night vision goggles will be able to get the benefit of the illumination. The illumination at 2nd El Alamein was different because they had different equipment, but it was quite innovative in the way that it was used. 8th Army had a number of anti-aircraft searchlight batteries. These batteries had huge searchlights which would normally be used to illuminate attacking aircraft. What they were used for in the desert was actually to provide coverage of obstacles and to be able to search out into the distance, remembering that the desert is very, very flat, that the long range of the beams could be used to scan for targets and also illuminate targets for bombers. This was one of the factors that increased the effectiveness of the Desert Air Force as it was utilised as the very long-range artillery. 8th Army was quite short of heavy artillery, and so the Desert Air Force was used to fill that void, and it was done at night with the support of the anti-aircraft searchlight batteries. One of the other interesting roles played by gunners at night was that of the Australian 12th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery. They fired tracer over the head of troops to identify lanes that had been cleared by engineers and to highlight the direction of the advance. At night, navigating in the desert was particularly difficult because of the fact that there were no landmarks from which to navigate off. The fact that the anti-aircraft guns firing tracer pointed out the direction that soldiers needed to travel in made it a lot easier to coordinate. That was very important because the gaps in the minefields that had been cleared were quite narrow. The next task that we're going to look at is counter-battery fire, and this is a very important artillery task. The aim of counter-battery fire is to destroy, neutralise, or force the redeployment of enemy indirect fire weapon systems. This type of fire includes the engagement of all components of enemy indirect fire systems, such as weapon platforms, ammunition dumps, sensors, and C2 assets. To achieve lasting neutralisation, large numbers of guns and ammunition are necessary. Counter-battery fires can be planned in advance as part of the attack or react to opportunity targets when supporting defensive activities. So that definition is as per Employment of Artillery 2009. It is one of the key tasks of artillery. It is also one of the key threats because as we look to neutralise enemy artillery, they will be looking to do the exact same thing. And that is encapsulated in Alan Smith's book, the title of which is Do Unto Others. Counter-battery fire, often referred to in coalitions as counterfire, is described as the attempt by enemy artillery to disrupt and, if possible, destroy artillery assets of our own offensive support. The careful sighting of artillery can minimise target detection devices and also the response from associated counter-battery fires. Such masking may also be combined with concealment and movement. Accurate counter-battery fires requires the use of the following locating equipment. Radar. Radar relies on the ability to track the projectile. The best defense against radar is to ensure that the highest possible charge is used, therefore keeping the trajectory of the round as flat as possible and lower to the ground. If the round is close enough to the ground, it may be lost in ground clutter or behind a crest between the gun and the radar. And sound ranging. Sound ranging devices or acoustic sensors rely on the undisturbed travel of sound waves from the firing guns to the sensors or microphones. Many systems can be defeated by dispersing guns and conducting all adjustments for missions at fire for effect. This may confuse sound ranging systems as it may be very difficult to classify individual acoustic events. That is also out of the doctrine. A couple of things with that. There was no radar in 1942 in the desert. However, the ability to mask given the terrain, that is not an option because of the fact that the desert is so flat, very difficult to find places where you can hide guns. However, definitely if you haven't had a listen to the two-part episodes where we looked at the deception plan, the moving of the guns and the movement of all of the ammunition that would be required, and it was a prodigious amount of ammunition, was all part of a carefully constructed deception plan. Because where the main weight of the guns was going to be, that was highly likely to be the main effort of the 8th Army attack. The whole point of the deception plan was to make Rommel think that the attack was going to be coming from the south. Sound ranging at Alamein was definitely a capability that was utilised, as was flash spotting. So flash spotting in the desert, that is the perfect environment for it because on a good clear night, you can see a very, very long way. And that enabled, once all of the components for adequate flash spotting were put in place, that enabled very accurate location of the enemy guns. And this is part of the struggle that is the counter-battery fight, locating enemy hostile batteries. The Allies put a lot of effort into deception planning, up to and including the creation of dummy gun positions, so that when counter-battery fires were called for by the Axis artillery, they would actually fire on dummy positions and no casualties would be inflicted. They would be wasting precious ammunition. There was much less of this work on the side of the Axis artillery. As we talk about counter-battery fires, we're going to be talking about the role of the counter-battery office. If you're interested in the development of the counter-battery office, definitely have a listen to our episode where we looked at Vimy Ridge. This is where this concept first came about. This is where they were able to put together aerial spotting, flash spotting, and sound ranging. They were able to put it all together to be able to very accurately locate German batteries in the attack in Vimy Ridge in 1916. Once again, we come back to a recurring theme for Second El Alamein, and that is the fact that the planning and execution of the battle is very similar to a late World War I battle. Before this, the Australians did have a counter-battery office. That was a part of the 1st Australian Corps, and it was active during the siege at Tobruk. Nigel Evans, in his artillery website, does a really good job of describing the survey elements that were available in the Western Desert. He writes that the artillery in Tobruk included 4 British field regiments, mostly with assorted guns. The counter-battery battle was mostly undertaken by an Australian field regiment with 60-pounders and 4.5-inch howitzers. The degree of success is unclear. It is unlikely that the available counter-battery resources could achieve a useful amount of destruction or neutralisation, and if effective, it would only be temporarily able to neutralise the hostile batteries. Since neutralisation was only effective while counter-battery fire was falling, the small artillery force meant that such fire was limited. In July 1942, the perceived Japanese threat to Australia meant that the Australian Survey and the medium regiments were returned to Australia, with most of the Australian Corps. No survey elements were left with the Australian 9th Division. The expansion of the Western Desert Force into 8th Army with 2 and eventually 3 corps brought no additional survey elements, and so the withdrawal of the 2nd 1st Australian Survey Regiment at the end of 1941 almost halved the theatre's organic counter-battery target acquisition capabilities. However, air photographic coverage was good and well suited to finding hostile battery positions during the static phase of the war, although air photography did not necessarily reveal if batteries were real or dummy. Furthermore, it appears that all corps had counter-battery staffs, and there was a counter-battery officer at headquarters 8th Army. What was lacking was anything like the necessary number of medium regiments to deliver adequate counter-battery fire. Having the counter-battery staffs but lacking the means to conduct the counter-battery battle was a far from ideal situation. The problem with air photography was the time that it took to get the photos from the airfields to the counter-battery staff. For example, even in September 1942, only weeks before El Alamein, it was taking 36 hours to receive air photos from the RAF. To solve this, Royal Engineer Surveyors and the Royal Artillery Counter-Battery Section was moved to the RAF Reconnaissance Wing headquarters. This enabled prompt photo interpretation, counter-battery analysis, and accurate calculation of hostile battery coordinates from air photos. The results were then communicated to the counter-battery staff at the formation headquarters. By the end of the Alamein battle, results were being received within 4 or 5 hours of the aircraft landing. Air photos were the primary means of accurately locating hostile batteries. Flash spotting and sound ranging were used to determine which batteries were active. Before the Alamein battle started, there were some destruction shoots against a few active hostile batteries and neutralisation against roving guns. Nevertheless, all hostile batteries were silenced at the start of the infantry assault, but as the attack progressed, hostile batteries moved to new positions, so counter-battery intelligence was never fully up to date and Allied casualties increased. The counter-battery battle was fought by 30th Corps with the 3 available medium regiments as an ad hoc medium artillery group and up to 4 field regiments. This counter-battery group was commanded by the CO of one of the medium regiments because by this time the Corps Commander medium artillery position had been removed, but remember, we are before the development of the AGRA. The normal method of engagement was the bombard. 3 medium regiments had 6 batteries and there was a small Free French battery, in all totaling 32 4.5-inch and 20 5.5-inch guns, the latter using a 100-pound shell, giving a maximum range of 16,000 yards. Of course, the new scale of AGRAs meant that there would have been 1 for each of the 3 corps at El Alamein, at least 24 medium batteries, 192 guns. We can only wonder what that AGRA support would have made to not only to the counter-battery fire, but also to the fire planning that was done in support of the infantry and armoured attacks. But that is part of the evolutionary changes that occurred during the Second World War as the importance of artillery was much better understood. I'm going to leave it there. What we're going to do next episode is we're going to look at a little bit more into the flash spotting and sound ranging because it's critical to be able to find those hostile batteries. We're then going to look at the way that the counter-battery battle was conducted. We'll then switch targets to the fire plan in support of Operation Lightfoot. Once again, if you've gotten something out of this podcast episode, please like or share it if you see it on social media, include it in your PME program. Reach out to us if you've got any ideas for podcasts as well. Always keen to hear what people are using the podcast for and what they would like to see us do. The long-term plan is I'm very keen to finish the Battle of France.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.